So we're going to do a brief class on wire weaving. We're going to go through a couple examples in period, as well as how to create your own piece start to finish. So the first thing I kind of want to touch on is the class is called Introduction to Viking Wire Weaving. That's a little bit of a misnomer. So this style of jewelry creation has been found most certainly through several eras within our SCA scope. I primarily focus on finds found throughout the Viking area, so anywhere from 793 to about 1066. A lot of the finds and pieces that I try to base my pieces off of were found somewhere in that time period. So while it was used by other cultures, absolutely all the way up to 17th century Turkey, while it was used by other cultures, I primarily focus on the Viking age. So we'll get started with some period examples throughout history. The first one, and I did put the first link that's in the Zoom group chat is my handout on creating a piece. The second link is the documentation that I'm going to go through really quickly and talk about some examples. So if you did want to follow along or keep a copy, it is there for you. So the first one we're going to go through isn't actually necessarily a wire woven piece, but it is an important step in creating a piece. So there were several pieces found in the Mastemyr chest. So that was a tool chest discovered in 1936 in Gotland, Sweden. 200 items were recovered from the chest at least. The one that I look at the most are two draw plates. Draw plates have a couple uses. They can be used to create wire. So what they would have done is taken an ingot of silver or an ingot of gold and started to forge it out into smaller diameter, and then they would have drawn it through the draw plate to finish it, so it got it nice and small and also gave it that uniform round shape. The second draw plate may have been used to actually create the pieces. So as you go through and start making the wire woven piece, you start off with what looks like basically a tube. So you're gonna see it's hollow here in the center. We put it on a mandrel, so it comes out pretty thick. At the end, we draw it through the draw plate to pull it all together. The presence of the draw plates in the Mastemyr chest to me show that our construction, while not documented in period, does provide enough evidence that the methods we use today achieve similar results as what they did in period. So the draw plates found in the Mastemyr chest are quite an important discovery for me in the use of wire weaving. The second one that I find most intriguing is a find for a set of jewelry found in Sierra, which was discovered on the island of Sierra near Zealand. I do not know the discovery date at this time. I emailed the museum and I have not gotten a response. However, it did contain several pieces of wire woven jewelry. Most notably is a wire woven chain with a Thor's hammer attached. So this kind of shows us that it was used as jewelry and also to carry other pendants. Quite a few of the pieces that you may find do have pendants or Thor's hammers on them. So this find in period is actually really cool because it shows us a set example of what they may have done with it. The Derry Naflin patent, which was found in 1980 in the Derry Naflin Monastery, shows another period use of what wire weaving could be used for. So it is a silver and bronze patent, which would be used to hold the host. On the rim of it is a wire woven piece that was then soldered onto it, more of a decoration than any practical use. So looking at the patent, we can kind of assume that not only was wire weaving used as a jewelry piece, but it could also be used as decoration, maybe for clothing. Certainly if they would have used it for religious purposes. It may have been used for other things as well. Also found in more of a monastery setting, in 1774, is a wire-woven silver scourge dated back to the 9th century, which is currently on display at the British Museum. So this is actually a wire-woven chain that is held together at certain intervals with a wire-woven accent. And then at the end of it is a small, kind of like a millstone. It's a very small stone with a hole right through the center where they loop the weave through. And then it terminates in 4 wire-woven knots. So while we're not entirely positive what it was used for, it is possible that this was used primarily by monks for self-flagellation. So seeing all of the different applications, primarily I see wire weaving as jewelry or an accent piece. But certainly in period, they may have used it for many other things. And then finally, one of the last best jewelry pieces we have is the Hämeenlinna necklace. That was dated to 11th century. It's from Finland. And this shows a wire weaving example that is attached to a ring and a pendant hanging from the ring. What's interesting to me about this one is the wire weave on this is open. So normally we tend to draw our wire weaving pieces closed. Seeing it open is another example of just how they may have worn it. Certainly being open does have its pros and cons. It is a little thicker, so it's a little easier to see, but it's also a little more susceptible to damage, especially if something happens to that tube and it crushes. However, it's a very interesting find, and it's in excellent condition, so the image of it is exceptional. So it's a great way for us to see how it was constructed and how they may have hung something from it. Unfortunately, there is not much information on how the wire weaving was done in period. There is a similarity between what we know as trichinopoly and a similar method, which is called loop and loop. Visually, loop and loop and wire weaving look very, very similar. The construction methods are slightly different. Wire weaving will use a piece of wire that is woven together, or multiple pieces of wire that are woven together. Loop and loop uses soldered rings that are woven together. So the differences are pretty marked, but since it's very similar, we can guess that they would have gotten the idea from using loop and loop chain and use wire instead. So we do have finds dated to the Viking Age that are loop and loop. However, most of the finds for loop and loop go back past the 8th century, while most of the wire weaving finds typically start just around 7th to 8th century. So loop and loop was much more prevalent before wire weaving. Since we can look at the results of what we have today versus what the results are in period, it is pretty reasonable to assume that our methods are similar. You would need a sturdy dowel to weave around. That way you can get the round shape and pull it through. You would need the wire. You would need certain tools to be able to finish it. So while we don't know the exact period reconstruction or construction methods, we can pretty much extrapolate that our methods today are similar, if not quite the same as what have been used in period. So there's very little tools needed to get started in wire weaving. First and foremost, you need a dowel. So it can be anything. This is a wooden dowel about 10 inches long. It can be wood, it can be metal, as long as it's sturdy enough to be able to withstand the wire being woven on it. You may need an awl. So this is pretty helpful for getting into tight spots where the wire gets too tight on itself and you can't quite work it through. It comes in handy. You will need a basic plier set. When I say basic plier set, you'll need a pair of cutters, you'll need a pair of round pliers, and you'll just need a small jeweler's pair of regular pliers. The cutters you use to cut the wire, the regular pliers you can use to pull through pieces that are a little harder to pull through, or when you start running out of wire and you just need a little extra. The round pliers we don't use until the end. These help us create the round shape for the ending terminals, and so we can attach a ring or a pendant through. You will need a drawboard. This drawboard has 30 holes, and it snakes around. So it starts at the largest hole, and then it goes all the way around the board until it's finished. We'll use this at the end when we're ready to pull that through and finish the piece entirely. A couple of tools that you may find helpful but don't necessarily need are a tape measure. This is exceptionally helpful when you're drawing it and also when you're finished. I'll touch on that in a minute. And then a set of calipers. These are digital. Any calipers will do. This is really helpful when you're finished and you want to measure the diameter of the chain. That way you can help kind of pick your size terminals. Each chain will come out a different size depending on what thickness of mandrel you use. So the calipers help you to figure out what size terminals you're going to need for whatever project you're working on. So first and foremost, we have to figure out how much wire you're going to need. Unfortunately, that's easier said than done. I have not found a solid formula that tells you with X amount of wire, you get X length of chain. So it's a lot of trial and error there. Generally speaking, if you use a mandrel that is just under half an inch, so 0.35 inches, 16 inches will get you about a 26-inch chain, 18 will get you 29, 17 around 28, 19 will get you somewhere between 30 and 31. So, like I said, there's a lot of trial and error trying different lengths of chains, measuring it pre-draw and post-draw, which is where the tape measure comes in handy. Once you kind of have an idea and you can recreate with similar circumstances, if I use this much wire and weave it for this many inches, I can get this length finished chain. You won't necessarily have to measure it out as much just to make sure that you get that final length before draw. And of course, you're going to need wire. So there are several options you can use for wire. They all have pros and cons. So the first and easiest thing to do is craft wire. Craft wire is generally a mild steel. You can pick it up at most craft stores. You can order it online. It's really easy to work with, depending on the thickness and gauge of the wire. It's pretty easy on your hands, and it does hold the shape pretty well. That being said, it does have tendency to rust over time because it is mild steel. If you get a colored craft wire, like copper colored craft wire, it will still tarnish, but it may not show the rust. Stainless steel is another option you can use, only if the gauge is thin enough. So the gauge is how thick the wire is. The bigger the number, the thinner the wire. For the most part, 26 gauge is a really easy middle ground wire thickness to work with. If you do work in stainless steel, you would have to go to a higher number, so it's a thinner wire, probably a 32 gauge. It does hold its shine very well, so it is tarnish and rust resistant, not tarnish and rust proof, but it does help. However, it is not easy to work with. It does not want to hold its shape when you pull it through, and it tends to spring back. So for most projects, if you can stay away from stainless steel, it would be preferable. And the same thing with titanium. Although the cons are about the same as stainless steel, it's got about the same amount of pros too. But unless you're making something that really needs a stainless steel or titanium wire, I would try to stay away from them because they are just not easy to work with. The easiest ones to work with are copper, silver, and gold filled. So copper is super easy to work with. All of the properties are very similar to sterling silver. So there, it's a good starting point. If you plan on working in sterling silver, start with copper. If you want to see how a certain piece will do, if you do it in sterling silver, do a test piece in copper because it will come out almost exactly the same. It does hold its shape really well. It draws through very well. It's very nice to work. I would recommend starting there. Once you're ready, you can move on to silver. So the two classifications of silver are sterling and fine. Sterling silver is generally 92.5% silver and 7.5% copper. So because it does have the copper in there, like I said before, it's very similar to the copper. Keep in mind that copper does tarnish, and so sterling silver will also tarnish because it does have the copper in it. So it will react to skin. So if you have any problems with copper or you have any problems with metals reacting, sterling silver might not be the best, but it is certainly going to be better than just pure copper. Fine silver is 99.999% fine silver, so it's almost pure. So it is a dream. It works very well. It's very soft. It doesn't, because the sterling silver has a small amount of copper in it, it tends to kink while you're working it. Fine silver does not kink as easily. It's actually much easier to work with. Fine silver also does not tarnish, or I should say does not tarnish as quickly. So it is much easier on people who have sensitive skin. Most people who react to copper or brass or bronze or base metals like that, fine silver doesn't normally react to skin. So it's a much better option if you're making a piece for sensitive skin. And it does hold its shine much longer than a sterling silver would. Last but not least is gold filled. Gold filled wire, just like fine silver, super easy to work with. It's very easy on the hands. It holds its shape. It draws through the drawboard really well. It is overall, just like fine silver, super easy to work with, and it is also a dream. Gold filled is typically a wire that has been bonded to another base metal, like usually bronze or brass. So while it's not pure gold, it also is not gold plated. So it has enough of the pure gold in it that it does retain the properties of pure gold. So it won't tarnish or chip. It does stay nice and bright throughout its lifetime. The difference between gold filled and fine silver wire, if you don't have terminals, you can create a terminal by melting or brazing the fine silver at the very ends. You can't do that with gold filled because you just melt the gold right off. And essentially you're going to end up with is an expensive hunk of brass or bronze. Once you choose the type of wire, it is important to choose the gauge. So to start off with, I would recommend 24 gauge. It's a nice starter material. It's not too thick, but it's also not too thin. From 24 gauge, go to 26 gauge, which is just the next step up. It's just slightly thinner, but it is a little easier to work with. When you're picking a wire, also keep in mind how hard it is. So wire has different hardness indicators. So we have half hard, which is harder to work with, but it's not impossible. Or we have dead soft. Dead soft is the easiest to work with because it's the easiest on the hands. It gives almost no give back. So when you're picking a wire, try to pick one that's dead soft as opposed to half hard, because it is going to be easier to work with. And it'll overall be a little better experience. So what we're going to do, today I'm going to use copper wire. I got this from Rio Grande. So what you're going to do is always start with a piece the same thickness as the piece you want to do. So if you're weaving in 26 gauge, use a piece of 26 gauge wire to start. If you don't use the same gauge, so if you end up using like a 24 gauge wire, which is just a little thicker, it will prevent it from being drawn as close as possible. So what we're going to do is cut off a pretty generous amount of wire, a couple feet, maybe 3 feet or so. And then you can do this with anything rectangular. You can use a ruler, a piece of yardstick. I prefer to use my fingers. So I take 3 fingers and I start wrapping the wire around my finger, and I'll do it 4 times. So I want 4 loops, and then we're gonna cut it off and slide our fingers out. So you basically end up with a wire oval. So I put 1 finger through the end of the oval, and then starting at the top, you're going to pinch it and twist. We want to end up with, work your finger out, you want to end up with is a small hoop. So once you have the small hoop, there are 4 hoops that make up this large one. We're going to pull those apart. And we are going to make a 4-leaf clover. And then each one of these 4 leaves are going to get pinched just a little bit. We want to end up with a slightly thinner 4-leaf clover. So then this is going to get bent up toward the center. So each one of these loops gets bent up and adjusted so they're a pretty even distance. And at this point, we have what looks like a tiny metal claw. So that's how we're going to start it. Starting it is the hardest part. Once it gets going, it turns really easy. So we're going to take this claw and put it on the mandrel, and then reposition each loop as necessary until it's all on the mandrel. Now at this point, if you want to use a piece of masking tape or painter's tape or a cloth tape and wrap it around just a little bit of the top of the mandrel to hold it in place, we can. We're going to take another piece of wire and cut it, and off we go. So I always work right to left. You can do this left to right as well. Basically what you're going to do is between these first 2 loops, we're going to slide the wire behind it. So you just have enough, and then you're going to pull it almost all the way through. And what we want to end with is a small piece of wire, maybe ½ an inch or so. This gets bent down and around the mandrel to the left. This long piece that we still have left here is going to get pulled down across it and to the right. So what you end up with looks like a very small head. This is what we want to end with. Once you have that one, you're going to proceed to the next set of 2. So you're going to go behind the next set and pull it. This time we're going to pull it pretty much all the way through. And it's going to form a small loop. And then this is going to get pulled down and to the right again. And so what we've made now looks like a set of head and arms. So there's 2 of them on here now. Once you start that one, we're going to go to the next pair and do the same thing. And then we're going to repeat it one more time. This is going to be the basis of our wire weave. So everything is going to build off of this first set of stitches. So once you're finished, you're going to notice that we're back to where we started. So we should end up right back here again. So to add on for the next row, this loop that we made originally, this very first one, you're going to put it behind that little head that we made. So it's going to go through the back and all the way through. And you're going to notice that we have now made, right underneath the first one, we have a second stitch here. So we are just going to repeat that pattern all the way around. Go through behind the next loop and pull it through. And then we're going to go behind the next one and pull it through. And so on. And that is all there is to it. So the next step, once you've started, is figuring out how you want your final weave to look. We have a couple options here. The easiest and quickest way to do it is to go back through the row that you just did. It's called single weave. So single weave looks like this. So you can see that it's a very open weave. There's a lot of space here between these areas. Single weave is going to be the loosest weave that we have. Double weave and triple weave are very similar. So if you do the double weave, what we're going to do is find the one we just did and count 1, 2 from the bottom. And you're going to put it through that one and then pull it. And then you're just going to repeat that pattern through the entire process. The double weave will come out a little tighter. So it's going to look like this. There's not as much space between here. So it is a little closer together. And the triple weave is going to look almost the same. There is very little visual difference. So it does look very, very similar, but it's a little bit thicker. So depending on what you're using it for and what application, if a thinner weave is going to work better for you and you want it nice and tight, a double weave is the best option. If you want a little bit thicker, I would go for a triple. So for a triple, we would count 1, 2, 3 from the bottom and put it through there. So this is going to encompass 3 stitches per row. So once you decide what weave you want to go with, we're going to start that after you do about 3 rows. So even if you want to do a double weave, once you get about 3 rows in, that would be the time to really decide and start doing that pattern. That way, the whole piece looks pretty uniform when you're finished, because it is very apparent to see when you go from a single to a triple or when you go from a single to a double. Because when you pull it through, that single weave is going to be looser, so we can see that shift there. So once you have everything going, everything's looking pretty good, there are going to be some issues that you can run into. So for example, on this one, there are a couple rows that are relatively close together, and then I have a row here and a row there that are super far apart. Thankfully, they're pretty easy to fix. So if you're working on a piece that's too far apart and you need to bring that closer together, then what you're going to do is all of the other rows around it, you're going to weave just a little bit looser. So if you can see here, they look like they're pretty close together. So what we're going to do is weave it so it's not quite as close. That gives just a little bit more of a gap. And then the next one is going to get pulled tighter. It will take a few passes to really look like you're making a difference, but this will fix the problem. That way you don't have to halfway through and find out one of those rows is starting to get just too big. That way you don't have to scrap it and restart the whole thing. The nice thing about wire weaving is most of the mistakes can be fixed in the draw. It is a rather forgiving art, so almost everything that happens one way or another will be fixed. If you can try to do your best to mitigate it prior to drawing it through, that is a little better. Because if it is, too wide, you are going to end up with some of the weave that is very big. It's going to end up in a big loop while the rest of it's nice and close. But again, almost everything can be fixed in post. So once you are at a point where you need to add more wire, what we're going to do is go until you cannot weave anymore. So that is up to personal preference. If you feel like you can get another row out of a little tiny piece of wire, or if you want to stop with, a couple inches left, largely personal preference, but you can always add more wire. So the thing we're going to do is we're going to cut it off so we have just a tiny little part sticking out right here. We're going to take another piece of wire and cut it, and we're going to look at the stitch that we just made, and we're going to redo it, basically. So what you're going to do is take right where you ended. So if you're doing a double weave, you're going to count up 2 from the bottom, and triple, you're going to count up 3. On the other side, it is not going to look like it's correlating. So on the other side, if you count up 2, it's going to look like it's coming out on the 3rd stitch, and that's where it's supposed to come out. If you do 3, it's going to look like it's coming out on the 4th one, and that's perfect. So basically, you're just going to redo the one we just did. So we're going to put the wire through where we just were and pull it all the way through until you have just a little bit, very, very similar to the way we started it. And then you're going to bend this down to the left. And this is going to go down to the right. So we've essentially made, looks like we've started over at the beginning, and you are going to keep going from there. Once you get all the way around, you're going to end back where you started or where you began. This is going to get wrapped up and pulled in. So this little beginning part is going to stay here, but this stitch is going to get pulled right into the rest of them. And you will never know when you pull it through that another piece of wire was added. So as we go through and we make the piece, this is where we're going to be conscious of how long we need to make it. Unfortunately, like I said, there's not necessarily a set formula. It's just a ton of trial and error. But once you have the length you want, we are going to take it off the mandrel The nice thing about this is, since you can make it as long as you want and add as many pieces as you want, you can make it any length. So once we are at a length where you say that is exactly how long it needs to be X length inches, then we are going to pull it off the manual. Start putting it through the drawboard. So you want to start at the largest hole possible on the drawboard. That's going to be different for every board. On some, it just goes straight down in the line for the biggest to the smallest. On this one, it is actually a snake pattern. So it starts on this one here, and it goes down, and then it comes back up the next row, and then each row after that until we get all the way down to the bottom. I added 2 holes at the bottom, so then it goes through this one and then that one. The trick is to pull this slowly and smoothly. If you pull it too quickly or if you pull it too hard, sometimes the end wire can have bends and kinks in it just from drawing it out. So we want to draw it as smoothly as possible. We only want to pull it one direction. So if we pull it through this way, and then you get almost to the end, try not to pull it back the other way. Once you pull it back through the other way, you can loosen these, what we just did, and it may not pull as tightly as possible. So we are going to work this through our entire drawboard, going as slowly and smoothly as possible until you reach the end of the drawboard. Once you're at the end, you're finished. So it's actually not a very difficult art and science. It is certainly very relaxing. It does have its challenges, but for the most part, like I said, it is a very forgiving art. So everything kind of works out in the end. So once you pull it through, there's a couple steps left. The first one I do is look for any wires that may have escaped while drawing the piece through. So I will take like a washcloth or a cleaning rag, like a silver cloth or a chamois or something, and run it along the length of the chain. Sometimes when you draw it through, some of those spare wires that we cut and twisted are going to pop out in the final weave. If you find any, it is fairly easy to take care of them. You have 2 options. The first one is just cut them. So if they're long enough and you want to cut them, you can. Make sure they get cut pretty close to the weave, and then take your awl, and as much as you can, there is going to be a small little nub left that's going to be kind of sharp. So as much as you can, try to work that back down and into the weave. So basically, we're just going to take the awl and move it back and forth a little bit, and then try to get that wire in. If you catch it before you're finished, or it's still a pretty open weave, you can take those wires and work them right back in. No matter what method you choose, once you either cut them off and then tuck that tiny sharp end back in, or tuck the whole wire in, make sure you draw it through at least the last few holes. That way the whole thing draws and constricts around that area, and it'll keep it as much as possible from popping out again. It's always better to be safe than sorry, so at least go through the last 3 holes and try to make sure that that either wire or that sharp piece is no longer a problem. So once you're finished, I will run it along the whole length of the chain again, make sure it doesn't snag on anything else, and then we are ready to finish it. So there are a few ways to finish the chain. First and foremost, you would need a terminal. Terminals can be anything. They can be a bead cone you got from a craft store. They can be a solid cone that you got from a craft store. They can be silver or gold colored. Typically what we're looking for is a cone about that long. It's not very big, but we're looking for anything that we can just tuck the wire into an opening and keep it from coming out. And then we're looking for another hole on the other side where we can kind of put a wire through and make sure that it stays in place. So if we did our weave in 26 gauge, I would recommend at least a 20 gauge for this, 20 gauge wire for this part. 20 gauge wire is a little thicker and it helps to keep it into place. So because it's a little thicker, it's a little hardier, it's harder to bend, harder to break. So what we're gonna do, this is an 18 gauge fine silver. What we're gonna do is take our pliers and somewhere near the end, leave about a ½ inch, and we're gonna bend it into an L shape. So you are going to be left with a large metal L. So if this is our weave, we are gonna find a spot somewhere on the top here, and we are gonna work this L, here we go, into the weave and back out the other side. So you essentially end up, looks like a hook. So you're gonna take this part here and bend it straight up, and this will resemble a tiny little fishing hook. So the next part, we are gonna take our terminal and this longer wire part, you're gonna slide the terminal on and all the way down. So once you hit the end, we're gonna be at where our wire weave is. We're gonna take our pliers and grab the top part of this wire. With our other hand, we're going to grab the top of the terminal here, and you are gonna pull down as hard as you can because we want the terminal to settle into place. So we want it to go down as far as possible, so when we're ready to finish it, it's not gonna go anywhere. Once you have it down as far as you can pull it, then we take this large wire right here again with our pliers, and you're gonna bend this at a 90-degree angle. So it's gonna end up, again, looking like kind of a V. And this is where the round pliers come in. At the base of this 90-degree angle, so right here, we're gonna put our round-shaped pliers and clamp down, and you're gonna take this and bend it up and rotate the round pliers. And then it looks like we have another hook on here, and you're gonna pull the wire across itself. So this is the shape we're looking for. We now have a very small hoop. From here, we are going to leave this on the round pliers. And once again, we're gonna start pulling the terminal down as we go, because we wanna make sure this doesn't go anywhere. With your other pliers, we're gonna take this little underhang wire here and start wrapping it around the rest of it. And this loop is gonna provide enough force to hopefully, once we are finished, keep the terminal in place. So when you're finished, this terminal should be pretty solid on here, and we shouldn't be able to pull it or twist it. That part's important because if it's too loose, there is a chance that that could work the wire loose, and that could pop right off. So once you have it nice and tight, this one isn't going anywhere, then you flip it over, and we are going to see that on this side, this was the side we started with, we still have this long piece here. Those are our starting loops, which we no longer need. So you're just gonna go ahead and cut those right off, and then it's gonna leave you with a ton of small wire pieces here. You can go ahead and pull those right out because those are no longer important. And once you're finished, we end up with a side that looks similar, if not identical, to the other one. On this one, you can see where it went from a single to a triple weave. If you look here, you can see a lot of space in that first top part and then not as much on the rest of it. This is the part where it went from single to triple. So that should get covered with the terminal. So you attach the second terminal the same way as the first one. And then once you're finished, you have a piece that has two terminals at the end with the loops. So from here, we have a lot of options. You can attach a pendant to it. So you can finish it like this one, which has a Thor's hammer on it, attached with a ring that just goes through these two loops. That is the quickest, easiest, and one of the more period ways to finish wire woven chain. If you just want the chain by itself, which is perfectly fine, we have a couple options for finishing. So the first one is to make a loop, and then on the other side, you are going to make a small hook. So that is similar to making the loop where you do still need a piece of wire to wrap around to push down on the terminal to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. But this uses two pieces of wire. One's going to be wrapped around to keep the terminal, and the other one you're just going to form into the hook. It's a little more complicated. So my preference is to make two loops, one on each side. And then instead of using a second piece of wire for the same hole to make a loop, we can do just a very small S hook. So this allows you to keep one loop on each side, but still use it as a necklace to be able to pull apart and then hook back closed again. So that's a quicker and easier way to achieve an unadorned chain without having to try to make the loop. But both options are perfectly viable. Once you're finished, that's it. So the easiest way to determine the terminals, which I should have mentioned, I have two different width of terminals. I have a 3.9 millimeter and a 5 millimeter. So this is where the calipers come in handy, because you can just place it right on the end of the wire weave and then see how wide it is. And that way you know exactly how big of a terminal you need. Most terminals you can get from a craft store. They don't have to be fancy. They don't have to be anything exciting, as long as it keeps the chain together and you're happy with it. Once you're finished, you're finished. So that was a real quick introduction. Create your own pieces. At this time, I am finished. Are there any questions?
And you guys can feel free to unmute yourselves to ask them directly.
Oh, I just saw the question from Nicolette. Those beginning claws cut right off. Once we start and we have a pretty solid base, those are no longer needed. So you don't necessarily need to keep those on there anymore. I keep them on until the end because it does give me a great way to pull it off the mandrel. Sometimes if you weave it too long, which I have done, then it gets stuck to the mandrel and it's extremely difficult to pull it off. So keeping that, inch long extra piece of wire really gives it a hand. Once we're finished, those are not important to the structural integrity of the piece and they can go. Wire stretching. That is a great question. I will be 100% honest with you. I don't know. but I will find out. I have not had too many problems with the wire stretching over time. I have had a couple problems with a wire inside snapping, and so when you touch a certain part of it or you move a certain part of it, you can feel the wires rubbing against each other. However, because of the way that it's constructed and the way it's pulled together, everything else around it keeps it in place, so it's not a big problem. But I am not sure about wire stretching, and that is something that I can now look at. But I do apologize, I can't answer that question at the time. Although I will say, yes, I will say, Nicolette, sterling silver and fine silver do tend to kind of work harden a little bit. So as you pull them through, they tend to get a little bit harder, especially once the wires are all pulled and jammed together. But it does lead to it being a little more brittle. So although it is pulling it as tight as possible is a much better method of creating a wire weaving than leaving it open, because there are less chances of it getting smashed, less chances of it getting dented or anything like that. That way you don't end up with a pancake. It does tend to make it a little more brittle than if it was left open, because it does put more stress on the silver. I have worked with copper as well in a woven sense. So I did weave a chain for another hammer out of copper. And this one, so far, seems to be holding up pretty well. I haven't had it snap or break yet in any of this kind of smaller wires. Unfortunately, like I said with the silver, it can be a little more brittle. So especially when you're cleaning or polishing it, it's important to not take, to take as much time as possible and make sure you don't use too much pressure. Any kind of change, if you're going super hard in polishing it, you really want it to get clean, and that wire kind of section of it goes from flat to bent really quickly, it'll snap some wires. So the suggested ways for storing. It depends on the metal. Sterling silver, you're gonna have to, if it's wet, wipe it down, store it dry. Don't leave it in the sun because the sun will tarnish it. So try to keep it in a darker, drier area. If you wear it every day, like I wear my silver one every day, at night I wipe it down and put it on my nightstand. And that's it. For copper, very similar. Just make sure it's always dry when you put it away. And so you're not storing it wet because that will lead to, or damp because it will lead to tarnish. Gold filled because it doesn't tarnish. I would exercise caution in storing it. I would try to keep it in a cool, drier place when it's not being worn, just to try to keep any moisture from getting into the weave itself. Again, I would try to leave it out of the sun because it will break it down faster. Scandinavians would wear these often. So it depends. We have had, and that is a great question about who would wear them. I would suggest, from some research that I've done and examples that I've seen, first off, they were probably used more for ceremonial purposes. So they weren't worn, they might not be worn every day. Usually they would probably be worn for important events, weddings, funerals, all things. But as far as who would wear them, it doesn't look like there's any restrictions on them. Certainly it would be usually somebody who could afford silver or gold, as those were the primary metals that it was created with. So you would be looking at someone who's may not be a Jarl, but they were definitely more of a wealthier class. Once we get into different areas of Europe, after that, it's a toss-up. like I said, we find in the monasteries, we find monks with them. We find patens with it on there. There is a 17th century example of a Turkish drinking flask that has copper wire weaving as the handle of the flask. So it seems to me that it was more, not necessarily reserved, but it was more easily accessible to those who had a little bit more money than your local farmer or blacksmith. Any other questions?
All right, looks
All right.
like you were clear,
Perfect.
Hjalmr. Thank you for teaching. Thank you,
Yes.
everyone, for attending. I'm going
Yes.
to end the meeting, which is going to kick all of you out, and then
Sounds
I
good.
will get this posted up.
Sounds good. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via Facebook, and I am more than happy to help.